Something just detonated on the internet, and if you blinked, you missed the fuse being lit. A grainy old clip of a 19-year-old Beyoncé sitting on the lap of a much older man in a room full of much older men just resurfaced on Daily Mail with zero warning and zero context. And the moment it went live, the entire timeline stopped breathing. Because this was not a leak, this was a launch. Somebody, somewhere, deliberately pushed the green button on a piece of footage that has apparently been sitting in a vault for over 2 decades. And they picked this exact week to do it. The question is not what the clip shows, the question is who signed the release form and why now. And that single question is now sitting on the desk of every publicist, every label executive, and every longtime Beyoncé loyalist who thought the archive era of celebrity gotchas was finally over. Cast your mind back to a time when Jay-Z was untouchable, not just wealthy, not just respected, untouchable. The Carter family sat above the industry like a monument nobody was allowed to graffiti. And then, over the past 12 months, that monument started sweating. The Busby litigation, the financial suits stacking one behind the other, the dismissals that came, yes, but never quietly. And instead of retreating, Jay-Z did something almost nobody at his altitude ever does when the walls close in. He went on the offense. A GQ sit-down that read less like an interview and more like a manifesto, the re-release of a landmark album, a brand new world tour, Beyoncé on the stage beside him, Blue Ivy in the choreography, the whole family used as a public shield, radiating one message on a loop. Nothing here is broken, everything here is bulletproof. Every appearance, every stage design, every wardrobe choice, every carefully leaked rehearsal photograph was engineered to reinforce that single thesis, that the Carters were not merely surviving the year, they were compounding out of it. And then, out of nowhere, this clip hits the front page. That is not coincidence. That is a chess move. Let us describe what is actually on the tape, because the framing matters more than the frame. A very young Beyoncé, said to be 19 at the time, is sitting on the lap of a grown man later identified in circulating discussion as Mark Schaffel, a name that has surfaced repeatedly in Michael Jackson-adjacent conversations. Around her, in the same room, are several other older men. There are empty chairs, there is space, there is furniture. There is no logistical reason for her to be perched on this man's leg, and yet she is. His hand is not floating politely by his side, it is cupped around her waist. She is being told, on camera, that she is about to be put on speakerphone with Michael Jackson. Her body language shifts. She is nervous. She is excited. She is 19. And a longer stretch of the same footage, according to accounts circulating across the last 48 hours, contains a moment where the man gestures her over with a line about talking to his uncle, "Come sit on my lap, come sit on my." There are, again, plenty of chairs. There is a sofa directly opposite. She sits on him. She sits on him because a 19-year-old girl in a room of established industry adults does what those adults instruct her to do, and that is exactly the dynamic the tape captures. This is the frame the internet is trying to process, and this is the frame somebody decided with full intent to release right now. Let us be extremely careful about one thing before we go further. Nothing about this story is about blaming a 19-year-old woman for being in a room she should never have been placed in. That is not the conversation. That has never been the conversation. The conversation is about the architecture of the industry that put her there, the older men who orchestrated the room, and the invisible hands that are now, decades later, choosing to reintroduce that footage into the public bloodstream for reasons that have nothing to do with Beyoncé and everything to do with the man she married. Beyoncé, in this equation, is being used twice, once at 19 in the room, and once again this week on the front page. Because this is where the story splits wide open. The most jarring detail is not the clip itself. The most jarring detail is the timing. This is the same month Jay-Z is escalating his public visibility to levels the industry has not seen from him in a decade. The tour, the interviews, the reactivated catalog. Powerful men do not appreciate being reminded that they are one leaked file away from a redirection of the news cycle, and powerful men have vaults. That word matters. Vaults. Because we have all learned, especially over the last year, that certain industry figures do not simply produce content, they archive leverage. When Diddy's residences were raided, entire rooms of tape were cataloged and carried out in boxes. Nobody knows the full inventory of what left those homes. Nobody knows who else has similar libraries in similar rooms in similar cities, waiting on a spreadsheet somewhere with dates and captions and names and prices. That entire ecosystem of preserved footage did not vanish when Diddy's door was kicked in. It simply became known. And the moment something becomes known, it becomes usable. And now, in the middle of Jay-Z's most public year, a 20-plus-year-old clip of his teenage wife-to-be being physically anchored to another man's lap appears on Daily Mail with the polish of a coordinated press release. Somebody had to hand that file over. Somebody had to approve it. Somebody had to push it through legal, through publishing, through distribution. That is not a leak. That is a message. And the intended reader of that message is not the general public. The intended reader is a single man in a single office who now understands with absolute clarity what the next escalation would look like. Whispers surfacing this week argue that the message is aimed squarely at the Carters and specifically at Jay-Z, and specifically at his decision to keep speaking, keep touring, keep pushing forward instead of quietly absorbing the punches of the past year. In that reading, Beyoncé is not the target of the release. Beyoncé is the weapon. The most valuable public asset the Carter empire owns is her image. Bruise her image and you bruise him. Bruise her image and you also bruise every dollar attached to every endorsement, every partnership, every stadium hold that lives inside her name. That is what makes this feel less like tabloid content and more like a shot across the bow. Now let us zoom in on the man in the chair. Mark Schaffel is not a random extra in the frame. He was, according to accumulating discussion, working closely with Michael Jackson at the time. He has resurfaced in the past attached to a proposed unseen Michael Jackson documentary project, which means there is a plausible surface-level explanation for why this footage exists at all. He was collecting material. He was documenting proximity to the world's biggest star. He was, allegedly, building a portfolio. That is the innocent version. The uncomfortable version is that a middle-aged man is filming himself with his hand around the waist of a teenage girl who has been convinced that this is the price of a 2-minute phone call with her idol. And then someone, decades later, decides that this specific footage, out of everything in that hypothetical archive, is what the public most needs to see this week. That decision alone tells you the tape was never really about Michael. The tape was about who watches Beyoncé watch Michael. The Michael Jackson framing is a wrapper. The real product inside the wrapper is a 19-year-old Beyoncé and the visible discomfort of the room around her. The optics are, to use the flattest possible word, catastrophic. And they are catastrophic in a very specific direction. They do not embarrass Beyoncé. Grown adults do not blame a 19-year-old for being placed in a room. They embarrass Jay-Z. They embarrass Tina. They embarrass every adult who was in that girl's orbit at the time and either did not see it or saw it and stayed silent. In the parasocial logic of the modern internet, the person who looks worst in a video like this is not the person on the lap. It is the people who should have been in the room and were not. That inversion is exactly what makes the release so surgically effective. It weaponizes protection instead of blame. That is the pain point being pressed. That is the nerve being drilled. Let us pause the accusation for a beat and stack the receipts of what is publicly reported. The clip is being credited across multiple outlets as originating from Schaffel's own archive. Daily Mail carried the primary placement. Secondary aggregators picked it up within hours. Views across mirror uploads have already crossed the 4 to 5 million mark across platforms, and the growth curve has not flattened. Commentators as diverse as gossip veterans and long-form culture podcasters have arrived at strikingly similar language independently. The word warning appears in almost every top-tier thread. The word threat appears close behind. And in a particularly viral post that has been reposted thousands of times, an anonymous account wrote that certain elites can, quote, smell blood in the water, and that the Beyoncé clip is not the storm itself, but the first drop of rain before the storm. That single line has done more to shape the emotional weather of the past 48 hours than any official statement from any camp. That framing has taken over the discourse, and the discourse is now dragging the conversation toward a much larger question. If this is a warning shot, what is being warned against? The answer floating through comment sections, reply threads, and long-form breakdowns is uncomfortably consistent. Jay-Z, according to this reading, has been pressing forward into territory that certain other power brokers would prefer he leave alone. He is not simply defending himself, he is repositioning. He is redistributing narrative authority. He is reclaiming his own catalog while other people's catalogs are being repossessed. And in an industry where the ceiling is not made of glass, but of guarded footage, that kind of forward motion draws attention from the exact people who spent decades curating vaults specifically to slow men like him down. Momentum at his altitude is a provocation, and provocations at his altitude get answered. The Beyoncé clip is, in this reading, a demonstration, not a punishment. A demonstration. A polite reminder that you do not have to touch a man to injure him. You only have to touch a home movie of the woman he loves. And once that lesson has been publicly taught, the same lesson can be taught again, on a different week, with a different clip, on the same front page. And that reading is exactly why the internet feels so unsettled right now. Add to this the additional layer that people are refusing to let slide. Where were the parents? Where was Tina? Where was the management structure that was supposedly protecting this teenage artist during one of the most fragile transition years of her early career? Beyoncé, at 19, was not a small artist. She was already Destiny's Child. She was already a household name. The idea that she was moving through Michael Jackson-adjacent rooms without an adult chaperone whose actual job was to keep her off of laps is baffling to most viewers watching this clip in the year we are actually in. That is the piece that is generating the most residual outrage. Not the clip itself, the infrastructure that produced the clip. Because the clip could not exist without a room, and the room could not exist without permission, and the permission had to come from somewhere the public has never fully audited. And here is where the story turns from unsettling to genuinely dangerous. Because if this footage was sitting in a private archive for 2 decades, and if it can be released with this level of coordination on this specific week, that implies a broader library. It implies more tapes. It implies more names. It implies that the industry's older guard has a filing cabinet full of exactly this kind of material, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to be deployed against exactly this kind of target. That is the actual conversation, not the clip, the cabinet. And the cabinet, if it exists at anything close to the scale being suggested, is a rewrite of how modern media warfare actually operates in this country. Away from the cameras, this is how modern media warfare works. You do not need to fabricate a scandal when you can simply choose the release date of a real one. You do not need to hurt a man directly when you can hurt the person he built his empire around. You do not even need to say what you are doing. You just push the file to a friendly outlet and let the algorithm carry the payload. The algorithm has already carried it, by the way, 4 to 5 million views and climbing. Beyoncé's name is trending in tandem with Schaffel's, in tandem with Michael Jackson's, in tandem with Jay-Z's, in tandem with a vocabulary the Carter camp has spent years trying to distance itself from.
That co-trending, from a pure media strategy angle, is the entire point of the drop. It is not enough to hurt Beyoncé alone. The play is to plant her name inside a semantic cluster she does not want to live inside, and then let the recommendation engine keep watering that garden for weeks.
Now, watch what happens next. The playbook here is old and predictable. Within days, expect a Carter countermove. It will not address the clip directly because addressing the clip directly legitimizes it. It will come sideways, a stadium moment, a surprise release, a viral image of blue ivy that flattens the algorithm and forces the conversation to shift. That is how the Carters have historically absorbed public turbulence, and there is no reason to expect a different response now. But the very fact that a countermove is coming is itself the confirmation. You do not countermove against a nothing. You countermove against a message. And whichever countermove lands first will tell every seasoned observer exactly how seriously the Carter camp is taking the underlying threat. There is also a version of this story that ends with the release backfiring, and that version deserves airtime too, because a huge portion of the audience watching this footage is not reading it as damaging to Beyoncé at all. They are reading it as damning to the men who put her there. In that reading, the release has misfired badly. Instead of embarrassing the Carters, it has reopened a much older and much more dangerous conversation about how young black female artists were moved through predatory adult spaces for decades under the polite label of mentorship. And that conversation, if it catches fire, does not end with Beyoncé. It ends with an entire generational reckoning across the industry's oldest gatekeepers. Which means whoever pushed the button may have miscalculated the wind. A weapon aimed at Jay-Z may end up detonating in the laps of the very executives who thought they were holding the trigger. Either way, the meta-fact remains. This footage did not resurface accidentally. This footage was scheduled. This footage was chosen. And the person who chose it did so on the exact week Jay-Z's public momentum was peaking. That is not narrative. That is math. And math, unlike gossip, is very difficult to spin. There is one more piece of this that deserves to be maimed out loud. The screenshot circulating from the extended footage, in which Beyoncé appears to be leaning slightly backward on the man's lap while his arm stays fixed around her, is being described by commentators as one of the most uncomfortable pieces of celebrity archive material to enter public view in years. It is being compared, in tone, to old footage from other predatory adjacencies the industry has spent a decade trying to bury. That comparison is doing a lot of the emotional work right now. It is why the outrage is not evaporating on the usual news cycle. It is why the numbers keep climbing instead of leveling off. And it is why the Carter team almost certainly saw this coming before the general public did. The most powerful publicists in the country do not get surprised by their own clients' 20-year-old footage. They get warned about it. They get quietly offered it. And when the offer is refused, that is when the file becomes a headline. Which brings us back to the original question: who signed the release form? Because there is no version of this story in which the answer is nobody. Files like this do not travel from private archives to national tabloids by accident. Somebody had to email somebody. Somebody had to attach the clip. Somebody had to okay the caption. Somebody had to schedule the publication. That chain of custody exists, and it exists in writing, in inboxes, on servers, on invoices. And that chain will, eventually, be pieced together by someone with the resources and the motive to trace it. Whoever it turns out to be will not be a small player. Small players do not sit on tapes like this for 20 years and then hand them to Daily Mail with a bow. Small players do not have the reach to guarantee a coordinated placement across multiple outlets inside a single news cycle. This has fingerprints. Those fingerprints belong to someone with a name, a payroll, and an agenda. The most dangerous read is the one that keeps surfacing across independent commentators. The read is this: the clip is a probe, a pressure test, a checking of the room. Whoever released it wanted to see how loudly the Carters would respond, how fast their machine would move, how effectively their public shield would hold. If the Carters absorb it cleanly, more will come. If they visibly stumble, even more will come. This is not the last file. This is the first file. That is what the internet is quietly, collectively, correctly understanding right now. And that is why this week feels different from every other Beyoncé news cycle in living memory. Because the story is no longer about one clip. The story is about the release of that clip is telling us about the existence of every other clip like it. For the record, none of this is a case against Beyoncé. Every serious observer watching this footage is drawing the same distinction. The 19-year-old on the lap is not the story. The 40-something man with his hand on her waist is not even fully the story. The story is the person, somewhere in a corner office, who opened a locked drawer this week and chose which piece of preserved footage to hand to which outlet to hurt which competitor. That person is the actual subject of every real conversation happening online right now, even when nobody says it out loud. Every retweet, every duet video, every long-form breakdown is, in the end, an attempt to reverse engineer that decision. Who benefits? Who fears Jay-Z the most? Who has the archive access? Who has the media relations? Whittle those three lists down, cross-reference them, and the suspect pool becomes uncomfortably small. And when it does eventually come out, when a name attaches itself to that decision, this clip will look completely different in retrospect. It will not be remembered as a Beyoncé story. It will be remembered as the opening shot of a much larger public confrontation between old industry power and new industry power, with the Carters standing directly on the fault line. Historians of celebrity power will use this week as a case study. Publicists will teach it in private seminars. Every rising artist who watches this unfold will learn a lesson their handlers have been trying to teach them for years, that consent is not the only currency in a room full of adults, and that footage of a moment you thought was harmless can be repurposed against you 2 decades later by people you have never met. So the question ends up being simpler than the timeline suggests. Do you read this footage as a genuinely accidental resurfacing tied to a niche Michael Jackson documentary, quietly slipped out into the wild by a producer with poor judgment? Or do you read it as a coordinated media hit, engineered to destabilize Jay-Z at the precise moment he is refusing to shrink? Or do you read it as something worse than either of those? A preview trailer for an entire archive that is being weaponized in slow motion against anyone who forgot to bow to the correct people. Each door leads to a different version of the industry, and each version implicates a different set of adults who spent the past 20 years pretending they were only preserving history. Whichever door you walk through, one thing is not up for debate. The vault opened, something walked out, and the industry just told everyone in a language nobody can pretend not to understand that the next file is already sitting on someone's laptop with a publication date penciled in the margin.
Now it is your turn to weigh in. Drop your verdict in the comments and tell me exactly where you land. Was this a coordinated warning shot at Jay-Z and the Carters, engineered from inside the industry by people who felt threatened by his forward motion? Was this a careless promotional slip attached to a Michael Jackson documentary that got out of a producer's hands? Or was this the very first release from a much larger archive that the public was never supposed to see? And on Beyoncé herself, do you feel the internet has protected her the way she deserved to be protected? Or do you feel the conversation has been unfairly pushed onto her 19-year-old shoulders when the accountability belongs entirely to the adults in that room? Say it plainly. Do not soften it. This is the exact fault line where the whole story splits open, and the way you read it says more about how you understand the industry than any single frame of that footage ever could. Like the video if it made you think, subscribe if you want to be here when the next piece drops, because there will be a next piece. Turn the notifications on because the moment the countermove lands, we are covering it in real time. Speaks volumes even inside the silence this whole moment does. And silence, right now, is the one luxury nobody in this story can afford. See you in the next one.